Welcome to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. This week, a look at campaign finance transparency. The 2024 election is still a year away, but campaigning is already underway. Candidates have announced in several high-profile races, and fundraising has commenced. Disclosure of donations to campaigns and other groups seeking to sway voters has been a topic of debate for decades as watchdogs, reporters, and donors play a game of cat and mouse. To learn more about political spending on the federal level, we spoke with Dr. Sarah Briner, Director of Research and Strategy at Open Secrets, a group that seeks to demystify campaign finance. She starts by telling us what's new in federal campaign finance rules.
So the fundamental disclosure process for disclosing who you get money from hasn't changed since Watergate. All political candidates, parties, PACs are required to file regular reports with the government saying who's giving their money. Now, that all being said, there have been a lot of very significant changes with implications for transparency. The biggest and probably meatiest was the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, which now is coming on its close to 15th birthday. And that, again, didn't fundamentally change the disclosure process, but allowed for the creation of groups who could spend money on politics in unprecedented amounts of money. And while those groups still have to identify themselves, disclose, they can disclose information about their donors who might be giving $1 million, which can itself be hard to track down. So say I got money from a nonprofit called something like Americans for a Better America. That files with the IRS. They don't have to disclose any information about who they are. So even though the political committee does provide public information, that public information doesn't necessarily tell a complete story. So that's kind of the meatiest change that we've seen and has had incredible implications for transparency, partially because these groups can just spend so much money and we don't know as much about them as we do about the traditional bread and butter human and political action committee donors to political groups.
So let's talk about some of the bread and butter donors, as you referred to them. We're still a year away from the 2024 election. Not that if you watch cable news, you would know that. But the campaigning and fundraising certainly have begun in earnest. Are there any surprises who at this point are the big donors nationally?
I don't think I've been surprised by anyone yet. I may be surprised by some absences, but I think that the key there is that while the election has started and we all feel it, we all see it already with the emails begging us for our money, the oxygen in the room is being sucked up by the Republican presidential primary. And that is going to have interesting effects on who's giving because a lot of more mainstream Republicans are going to want to wait until they have a sense of who the anti-Trump is. That looked like it was going to be DeSantis. I'm not sure the waters are so clear on that anymore. I don't know if there's a clear sort of recipient yet. And once that's settled, I think we'll see a lot of the major Republican donors coming out of the woodwork. But until that happens, I think people are kind of holding their checkbooks a little bit close to the vest until they know who to back.
Here in Arizona, we're seeing an increase in failed 2022 Republican candidates continuing to push their campaign donors for money to cover legal fees and court fines for frivolous lawsuits that claimed election fraud. Are we alone in this, or are other places seeing this?
I think other places being the entire United States. If you were somebody who supported President Trump, or then candidate Trump, actually, he and his campaign is certainly seeking support for legal challenges. And so I think that that's not unusual. And we might not remember this, but Jill Stein back in 2016 was seen for a minute as the potential savior for the Clinton campaign. Like she could sue in Michigan, I think it was, and maybe overturn that result. She is still getting or has been receiving money from people supporting those legal challenges.
From 2016.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Hillary Clinton still has an active president, well, inactive-ish, but the candidates hold on to their campaigns for a while. And largely it's because of these legal challenges, cleaning things up, paying staff benefits, that sort of thing.
So 2022 was a big election for what we were talking about earlier, those dark money groups. We don't know who they really are. In that same election in 2022, Arizona voters approved a ballot initiative that forces further disclosure of large dark money contributions, especially political action committees. Has there been much in the way of efforts either on a national scale or in other states to try and do something similar and maybe have the voters do it if state legislatures or the U.S. House and Senate are not willing?
There are many efforts across the country to become the next Arizona on that front. I think it will vary by state what their approach is. Different states have different rules. It really depends on what the regulatory system looks like in that state as to what will happen. I think Arizona, it's actually not the first state to do something like that. We've seen efforts in Montana, Alaska, Maine, a few other places that have started requiring disclosure of advertisers. But Arizona is certainly the highest profile state that has passed anything like this recently. And I think that my interest in this, beyond the obvious, I'm a campaign finance dork just like you. I want to see what happens. But my interest is what the national groups are going to do, because they play in Arizona and they don't want people to know who they are. And so are they going to stop running ads? Are they going to set up, my hunch is that they'll set up Arizona-based subsidiaries and disclose who those are, but not the connection to the national group. So there's going to be funky ways this all plays out. But I think Arizona certainly is the state everyone is looking at right now. And different states will take their reforms in different directions.
One question, it's not really campaign finance, but it's money and government related. We've heard a lot lately about undisclosed gifts in the form of trips and other things to especially unelected officials like Supreme Court justices. Is increasing these disclosures, which are being fought, something that needs to happen?
I think that gift disclosure and trip payments and stuff like that is a wildly neglected area of political ethics. A lot of states and the federal government essentially made any kind of gifting flat out illegal after the Abramoff stuff, 15 years ago. But that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And it would be naive to say, oh, we made it illegal. Well, now we don't have to do anything. Yeah, but again, it's another one of those areas where if you're giving a present to someone and no one knows about it, how do we know about it? So it requires a little bit more investigative work by journalists and the public than simply looking at campaign finance records. But I think that the fundamental process is ultimately targeting the same problem, which is people with influence buying that influence by giving people things, be them trips or whatever. I think we need multifaceted approaches to this process. I think there should be disclosure via the campaign finance entities that we already disclosed through the election commissions and so on. And then also more from the institutions themselves, potentially saying, okay, member, can you go more into detail about why your net income went from 200,000 to 2 million in the last year? And there are disclosures for that, but it's quite broad and quite late. So I think that there could be, but you need that kind of cross-referencing to really get at what's going on.
All right. Well, thanks for spending some time with us.
No, this was delightful.
That was Dr. Sarah Briner, Director of Research and Strategy at Open Secrets. Last November, Arizona voters overwhelmingly approved Proposition 211, which forces any group spending $50,000 or more in a statewide race or $25,000 in a local race to disclose where that money comes from. But what many call the Stop Dark Money Law has been caught up in the state and federal courts ever since. To get an update on where the law stands, we spoke with the proposition's architect, Terry Goddard. The former mayor of Phoenix and past state attorney general is chair of the Political Action Committee that put Prop 211 on the ballot. We started by talking about what dark money is exactly.
That basically means money that's spent on politics, but you don't know who spent it. We don't know where it came from. And in Arizona, we've been awash with that. We've been tremendous numbers of dark money operations. Probably the most famous was in 2014, when a local utility basically managed to get very secretly 2 people elected to the Corporation Commission who set their rates. And I think voters woke up the next day or a few days later and thought, oh my God, we just let the local utility essentially in the driver's seat for setting rates for its own operations. There have been lots of other examples. There have been some in Tucson, some in Phoenix City Council races. There have been examples at the legislature and certainly in statewide races where big money operations didn't want to be identified with a particular contribution to a particular cause or particular candidate. So they used what we call dark money alternatives. They basically set up a series of 501c4. These are nonprofit advocacy groups which federal law don't have to disclose their donors. And so they put their money into that. And then that dark money organization was the one that actually bought ads for a candidate.
So people understand this only applies to Arizona. It doesn't apply to federal. So the groups, as I like to refer to them, Americans for America, or whatever, they always have such innocuous, sounding names. If they're donating to your presidential candidate of choice's campaign, this doesn't affect them. This is only dealing with Arizonans for Arizona, or some group like that, correct?
Or some joke with a similar name. Yes, exactly. Yes. Only Arizona, and it's only non-federal races. In other words, this doesn't apply to Congress or Senate or president. It only applies to statewide, legislative, and local races. So it does apply to city council and mayor races, all the way down to school board. Not a lot of dark money in school boards, but who knows? That could happen in the future. So what this new law will do is it basically says that if you're going to spend money for advertising for a candidate, you got to tell us who you are. You got to tell us where the money came from. And so if you're Arizonans for Arizona, as you just postulated, you've been operating sort of undercover, taking money from corporations and individuals, and then essentially laundering it, filtering it through your organization so that it becomes untraceable under previous law, and then spending it for political ads. You don't contribute it directly to a candidate. This is fairly important because a lot of people call it campaign assistance. It is, but it's an independent campaign. Those ads are purchased separately from the main candidate's operation.
I know in one of the federal lawsuits brought against this by Americans for Prosperity, they used the phrase governmental doxing because you required names and addresses and all of that. What people listening to this may not realize is that's standard practice in campaign finance. If you write a check or I write a check, not that I'm allowed to as a journalist, but if I wasn't, to a candidate, all of that is listed. And as someone who goes and plays in the campaign finance database, it's all there. So this is no change.
Yeah, the law in Arizona, for as long as I've been active, and that's been a while now, has been if you give, it used to be $25, now it's $50 or more as an ordinary citizen to a candidate. You've got to give your name, your home address, and your employer. Most of us, 99% of us, live by that law and contribute and disclose. But there are a few people, a few individuals, a few corporations who feel that they're special and that they don't want to have their names out in public. And so they use this dark money alternative. And that's what we're trying to stop with the Prop 211. And you got to ask a series of questions here. First, what are they trying to hide? If they're so afraid that having themselves affiliated with a candidate or a proposition, is it because, and I suspect this is the case, they think that affiliation would do damage to the campaign they're supporting?
Were we seeing before this law came in that more money was coming from the dark side, if you will, than regular contributions that had to be reported? Was the funding shifting in campaigns?
Well, it's hard to identify precisely the amount of secret money, but the so-called dark money was becoming bigger and bigger. It was in the tens of millions here in Arizona, and it's certainly in the hundreds of millions across the country. I like to say we're number one. I can't prove that, but we have as a percentage of the total political spend in our state, Arizona is 1 or 2 or 3. It's the very top in the country. And one of the reasons for that is that basically the Arizona law says that if the source of the funds is a nonprofit corporation, and it's almost 100% of the time it is, then they don't have to make any disclosures at all under Arizona law. This is before Prop 211. They basically said, just spend the money. You don't have to have a campaign chairman. You don't have to have a treasurer. You don't have to even have a local address. Just spend the money if you're a nonprofit. And that was an effort, I think, to give a free pass to any of these dark money organizations that wanted to come in and put their thumb on the scale.
As these records become more and more public, do you think these groups are just going to go away, or do you think they'll disclose? And do you think when people start looking at them, they might be surprised by what they see?
Well, I think people would be surprised. I think they will disclose. There are some where I'm sure that they are so adverse or believe that their connection with a particular candidate or a particular cause would be so toxic that they feel that they would do more harm than good by having their name identified. So those people will probably go away. So I think it will continue, and I think they'll continue the constant effort to try to hide in another way. I don't know what that trick is going to be, but I'm sure it's coming. But right now, I think we've made a very important step to make sure that in the future elections, the voters know who it is that's signing the big checks to try to support one side or the other.
All right. Well, thanks for spending some time with us and trying to clear all this up and explain where we are as we get ready for yet another election season.
Yet another election season, and hopefully one that is just a bit, perhaps a lot more transparent than the last one. That's my hope, and I think it makes for a more vigorous democracy. It makes for more credibility.
That was Terry Goddard, head of the Political Action Committee, Voters' Right to Know. While 2023 is an off year for most voters, that's not true for people who reside in the city of Tucson. City council seats in wards 1, 2, and 4 and the mayor's office are on the ballot this November. A recent article in the Tucson Agenda, a Substack newsletter written by former Arizona Daily Star reporters Kurt Prendergast and Caitlin Schmidt, pointed out issues with when the city campaign finance reports are released and when voters start turning in their ballots. I spoke with Kurt about that article and started by asking him about its first sentence, which says, quote, "If the goal of campaign finance rules is to keep voters from knowing who finances campaigns, then they're doing a bang-up job."
We had just launched like 2 weeks before, and we were sitting there like, all right, we have an election coming up. You know, what's one of the things you want to know about an election is who's bankrolling the candidates. And so we go to the campaign finance page on the city clerk's office website, just like every other reporter in town does, right? And we're sitting there and we're looking at it, and the most recent campaign finance information that the voters have was from like the end of April. So a solid like 2 months, the bulk of the campaign, there's just no information about money for voters to look at. And then, you know, the ballots have already gone out by that point, right? So we were sitting there watching it as we have no information to give to the voters, and voters are sending in their ballots, you know. And I think I did some math earlier this morning. I think it was 46% of the ballots were returned by the time voters got updated campaign finance information. So the election was essentially over by the time voters got that info.
So does the system get better? That was the primary. We've now moved on to the general. Do the dates line up better for the general, or is it going to be the same thing for those of us who like to play in the database.
Yeah, well, I think it's going to be a lot better than it was in the primary because at least you can have the information from the primary season, and then you'll have some more information. You have like a bulk. You can kind of see where the money's coming from. People will have a much better idea of who's financing campaigns for the general than they did for the primary.
Why has nobody changed this?
Campaign finance. That is like the question about everything to do with campaign finance is like, why are we doing it this way? And we're talking about dates right now. But if you actually look at like the reports that they filed, they're all different from each other. It's like you have to have an accountant's degree to understand them. They're not designed for like a voter to say, all right, so I got my ballot. I want to know who to vote for. All right, so this person, like who bankrolled them? No voter's going to do that. It's so unwieldy and to even know where to look. And so it's just designed that's why I wrote that lead, right? It's like this is designed to make it difficult to know what the deal is.
Yeah, and you and I have spent many years playing in that database as journalists in town. But as you said, for the public, it is not intuitive necessarily at all.
No, there's no part of this that is like designed to inform the voter. It all feels like they have a statutory responsibility to make this information public, and so they do that, and that's it. It's just like bare bones thing, and I don't want to knock them too hard, right? I mean, to be fair, like the website is getting better. The city clerk's website's getting better. They're at least trying, like that's okay. But just the entire system is geared away from the goal of okay, voters should know who's financing campaigns.
You also, in writing about it, gave an example about Prop 411, which was a road repair tax extension last year on the ballot. What did you find when you were looking into that?
What I found was similar to where we are right now, is when people voted for that election, they had an idea of who had financed that campaign. And this was like $740 million. This is a massive amount of money, and a lot of that's going to contracts to people, But when voters voted, they had no idea that hundreds of thousands of dollars had been dumped into that campaign. All they knew, I think it was like $27,000 was the total they knew at the time of voting, and it ended up being hundreds of thousands of dollars from all these different groups. And it was just an example of like that voters should absolutely know that before they vote.
When we look at campaigns, the big thing that especially voters always hear about is dark money. And we think about dark money on the presidential scale because that campaign is certainly off and running strong. We hear about it on the statewide scale. The election a number of years ago for the Corporation Commission was one of the poster children for dark money. Do we see dark money coming into our local or city or county elections, maybe even school boards, because those are becoming interesting elections too?
Well, I mean, I think if this fits that category, we had that was the Arizona Prosperity Initiative. I think that's the right name, buying up mailers for a candidate, and it just coming out of nowhere. And the last I heard is that the guy in charge of it was like, fine, I'll file a report on this in a kind of petulant way. There's disrespect for the process. If you're going to punt in money to a campaign, if you're going to try to influence public opinion for our elected officials, that should absolutely be known to the public. And if you don't want to talk about it, then don't do it.
Does mail-in balloting, which the city just did the primary, all mail-in, except for a handful of vote centers on Election Day, Arizona has a long history of mail-in. Does it make campaign finance more difficult because of the dates and because ballots are out so much earlier as opposed to going in on Election Day?
In 2019, the legislature moved the primary date up. So it was, in effect, it was like the end of August, essentially, to the start of August. But they didn't move up the campaign finance reporting deadlines. And they tie it in the statute to the election, as if the election was like a single day, right? So they have to do it like no later than 10 days before the election is how they put it. However, as we know, right, the election's over by Election Day. It's been over. Everybody returns their ballots so fast. You need to move up that date. You need to change it from the election to when ballots are sent out. That's the intent of that type of law, but the language is screwed up, and when they moved the dates of the primary, it just created this problem.
We're talking about the city elections. We've got state elections next year, federal elections next year. You and I have spent countless hours over our careers looking at these databases, and we hope people read the Tucson agenda. We hope people listen to us to find out what's going on. But if a voter is listening to this and says, I want to do it for myself. What advice do you have for them?
I think you would, my advice would be either get really dedicated to digging up data, block off some time in your busy schedule to do that, or read the Tucson Agenda or listen to, you got like that's what you got to do. But I don't have any good advice for them because the system is not designed for them. It is just absolutely not designed for a voter to do what you just described. It's just not. And so that's something that needs to change. The overall attitude of campaign finance needs to change to become more oriented towards educating the voter. And we talk about, like dark money and Prop 211 and all that type of stuff. These are these big time things, but they need to be done in the context of, all right, public officials, we are trying to inform the voters because they obviously need to know this information. If that attitude is not there, then all this other stuff is, you're just never going to win that battle. It has to be reoriented. And they have the tools, they have the technology to be able to do this so that it can be like updated. So the overall attitude, if that's the thing, if you're a voter trying to figure this out and banging your head against the wall, is that you should talk to your elected officials and you should say, I want the attitude of this entire thing to shift so that you are making it easy for me to inform myself about my vote.
And when you get lost, read the Tucson Agenda and listen to AZPM.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's the situation we're in.
All right. Well, thanks for sitting down with us.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for having me.
That was Kurt Prendergast of the Tucson Agenda. And that's the buzz for this week. Tune in next week as we preview Season 2 of Tapped, AZPM's podcast examining water issues in the Southwest. You can find all our episodes online at azpm.org and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for The Buzz Arizona. We're also on the NPR app. Zach Ziegler is our producer with production help from Desiree Tucker. Our music is by Enter the Haggis. I'm Christopher Conover. Thanks for listening.
Arizona Public Media's original programming is made possible in part by the Community Service Grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.